Imagine sitting as a child with a kaleidoscope in your hands. You lift it towards the light and slowly turn it. Tiny fragments of colored glass shift against one another, creating patterns that seem almost impossible in their complexity. Every slight movement changes the entire image. No pattern remains fixed. No arrangement survives unchanged. I often think the human soul is like that. Inside every person are fragments constantly moving against one another. Race, class, memory, language, sexuality, migration, gender, grief, religion, survival, family history, and the private wounds nobody else can fully see. When life turns the kaleidoscope, those fragments arrange and rearrange themselves into new emotional realities. A wealthy migrant and a poor migrant may cross the same border, but experience entirely different worlds. A Palestinian Christian and a Palestinian Muslim may pray differently, yet both may feel the same tightening in their chest at an airport security checkpoint. A black child in London and a refugee child in Berlin may never meet, but both may learn far too early that innocence is not distributed equally. The pattern changes depending on the light. And if the light shining through the kaleidoscope is colonial power, racism, surveillance, borders, patriarchy, economic violence, extraction, othering, then the resulting pattern of pain becomes deeply specific to that individual life. That is what intersectionality asks us to understand. Kimberly Crenshaw gave language to something many communities have already been living for generations. People do not suffer through one identity at a time. Human beings move through the world carrying multiple realities at the same time. And when systems fail to recognize that complexity, the most vulnerable people disappear through the cracks. Psychotherapy often makes this mistake. A therapist sees a migrant, a social worker sees a Muslim woman, a clinician sees a traumatized child, but human beings are not single-story identities. The moment we reduce somebody to one category, we freeze the kaleidoscope. We stop the movement. We lose the pattern. And once we lose the pattern, we begin misunderstanding suffering itself. I think this is one of the deepest failures of modern mental health systems. They often attempt to understand pain without understanding history, without understanding that you cannot view a person as one single identity. Assalamu alaikum. I am Talha AlAli. Today, we are entering Chapter 6, Complex Intersections. This chapter is about migration, identity, race, religion, gender, displacement, and the invisible systems of power that shape how human beings are allowed to exist in the world. And the ways our lives get caught in the crosshairs of multiple systems of power. Migration is not just moving your body from point A to point B. It is a psychological displacement. For many of our clients, the border does not end at the airport. They carry an internalized passport control desk inside their minds. Every time they speak in a clinic or walk into a supermarket or sit in a therapy room, they are subconsciously presenting their papers to a system that they fear will reject them. I sat with clients from different countries, Syria, Iraq, Eritrea, Libya, who have been rendered hypervisible as threats or invisible as non-beings. In Ireland or anywhere in the West, a Syrian woman's trauma is often only validated if it fits a specific Western script of suffering. Take for example a 15-year-old boy in Germany. His therapist kept praising his integration and told him to let go of the past, referring to the bombings he witnessed in Syria. By trying to make him a good migrant, the therapist performed an act of psychic erasure. The boy never came back. He felt that to be healed meant he had to be colonized all over again, and he has to erase an important part of his history, of his past. Now moving to the racialization of Islam and the suspect body, we must be brave enough to name Islamophobia not just as a religious bias, but as a structural and psychological force. A Pakistani man in the UK might not tell you about his fear of being followed because he's afraid you'll diagnose him with paranoia. But for a Muslim man in a post-9/11 world, this isn't paranoia. It's a rational response to a surveillance state. I have two friends, one Christian and one atheist, both from Palestine. When they went to study in the US, they were both targeted with the same Islamophobic hostility. Why? Because the system doesn't care about your theology, doesn't care about what you believe in, it cares about your racialized body. However, it's even harder for gendered Islamophobia. Muslim women are often treated as either oppressed victims, needing to be saved, or dangerous symbols of non-conformity. As therapists, we must stop trying to save clients from their own culture. If a woman wears hijab, the question is not why she's repressed. The question is, what does this garment mean to your spiritual journey? And we can acknowledge with these women that there are things that they love and doing themselves willingly, and there are elements of oppression. But to assume that they are oppressed and victims, and that's the category we give to them, that's where our work does not progress. And we just label them in the label that helps us just to access our own biases freely and act on them, not challenge them. But speaking of intersectionality, we have to stop at a very important concept, the concept of unchilding, the theft of innocence. This is perhaps the most painful section of chapter 6. Unchilding is a concept that describes how Black, Indigenous, and people of color children are systemically denied the privilege of being innocent. Imagine childhood as a mirror. When a white child looks in it, the mirror reflects potential and protection. But for a 12-year-old Black boy or a Muslim child who has seen war, the mirror the world holds up is distorted. It reflects aggression instead of trauma, and non-compliance instead of survival intelligence. In clinical settings, we see what is called diagnostic overshadowing. A Black child in the UK or the US is far more likely to be diagnosed with a conduct disorder, while a white child with the same symptoms get an ADHD or anxiety diagnosis. We are pathologizing their responses to oppression rather than treating the wound of the oppression itself. To decolonize therapy for a child, we must rehumanize them. We must reclaim the child. We don't just look at their behavioral assessment, we look at the collective stories they carry of faith, of migration, and of resistance. In addition, we must acknowledge the Western construct of gender. Now, when we speak of gender, sexuality, and colonial binaries, we must acknowledge that Western constructs of gender, the rigid male-female binary, were often exported through colonial violence to undermine indigenous and non-Western ways of being before colonialism started in its form. Identity in the diaspora is like an unfinished building. For a queer Syrian refugee, the foundations of their identity might be in a land that is currently unsafe, while they are trying to build the roof in a host country that treats them with xenophobia. They are navigating layered marginalization. They would face homophobia from their own community and racism from the affirmative Western LGBTQ+ community. Our job is not to give them a prefabricated Western queer identity, but to help them build their own structure that respects their cultural soul and what they want to be and where they want to be. To conclude here, solidarity is the foundation. As we close chapter 6, remember, intersectionality is not a peripheral concept. It is the terrain of modern suffering. Decolonized psychotherapy asks us to step away from the expert chair and into uncertainty of co-creation. We must stop asking, what is the problem? And start asking, what has your life demanded of you to survive? That world where Black children are believed, where migrants are heard in their own language, and where the soul is seen as Kaleidoscope, that world begins in our rooms. Thank you for staying with this difficult, necessary work. In our next episode, we move into Chapter 7, Pluralistic Psychotherapy, where we discuss how to actually weave these different ways of knowing together. If you find this podcast and these conversations meaningful or helpful, please consider subscribing and share the podcast with others who may need these conversations too. Your support helps these important discussions around healing, identity, and decolonized mental health to reach more people.